How many of you were here in October when John last came? Okay, several of you. John is a wonderfully engaging, dynamic speaker, and in my opinion, I think he has connected the dots between the agendas of the corporations and of the media and of this growing theocratic movement, this religious right wing that several of you might now be hearing a bit more of, especially with the judiciary stuff that's going on, better than anyone else I know. His book, Fixing America, I encourage you to read it. Afterwards, I think he'll be sitting down here and you can purchase a book if you like. In the narthex where you walked in, there are several books mostly wrapped around the theme of the 9/11 that you can purchase as well, and some other material. John is going to speak primarily on two subjects tonight, and then Q&A, open game for everything. The first one is the whole mystery behind 9/11. And the second part of what John is going to engage us in is the growing threat of the Christian right, what's called the Dominionist Movement, a theocratic movement in our country that's really starting to take front and center. And so both of those subjects will be engaged tonight. It's been my pleasure to be able to host John. He's staying with us, and he's just a heck of a lot of fun. And so it's fun to have you back, and thank you for being here, John. So why don't we give him a good Seattle welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rich. I'd like to start off by thanking Roger Herbst and 911 Visibility Project for actually inviting me to come back this time and to focus mostly this time on the topic of 911 and to try to give you some kind of an insider's view of somebody who's been struggling with this for a year and a half now, and as those of you who were here in October know, somebody who's paid a fairly high price to be able to speak out on the issue. For those of you who don't know anything about my sordid past, my immediate reward for running for president in the New Hampshire primary was that the New Hampshire primary was on January 27th last year, and because I did well as a common citizen who challenged the President of the United States, I got invited to speak at the National Press Club last February 4th, and when I arrived in Washington, I was kidnapped by two phony Secret Service agents who intimidated me for 2.5 hours and finally let me go, and their identity still hasn't been established by anybody. And then a week later, when I went home to Miami, I was arrested on 14 counts of aggravated stalking against a victim that didn't exist, and I went to trial August 11th, and my public defender lost my defense, and I almost went to prison for 70 years, and the 911 truth movement, most notably a gentleman in Santa Cruz, California named Gabriel Day, got me a wonderful lawyer through the National Lawyers Guild. The charges against me in Miami were dismissed on August 16th. I went out on my book tour for the month of October in the swing states mostly to try to have some impact on the election. And in Cincinnati in late October, I was taken into custody by the real Secret Service for leading a plot to assassinate Bush. And they interrogated me for an hour and a half and let me go. But I'm happy to say that I've been fed free since October, and I don't expect to have any more problems with the Secret Service or the police. But that's a little bit, thank you. That's a little bit of, as many of you know who have been involved in the 911 movement, this government and this administration, and particularly this president, I'm a journalist, and I choose my words very carefully, and we're dealing with a criminal administration that has taken over the government of this country, and things are developing in a way that make me believe in some senses that 911 is actually the least of our worries, that there are even worse threats from the religious right that, as Rich talked about, I'll talk a little bit about at the end. But to get to the topic of 911 first, I gave a lot of thought to what I would say to you tonight, because I think it's very important now that there be a very open and frank public dialogue about 911 and about the 911 Truth movement so far and what has happened and where we go from here. So let me start by asking a question, but how many of you consider yourself active in and knowledgeable about the 911 Truth movement? Let me see a show of hands. And how many of you are new completely to the issue and just came out tonight because of the church or rich or whatever? That's great that there are new people here that are open-minded. Let me first give you a little bit of background about how it was that I came to the movement, because I've been a journalist for 35 years in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, Miami, and now in California again. And as all of you know, I'm sure, before the journalism trade was corrupted in the last 5 years as well, or the last 10 years, journalists operate basically on what can be proven. You can come to me and make any allegation you want to make about anything you care to talk about, but if you can't show me some documentary evidence of facts or present me with some sources that I can talk to and consider credible, no journalist that I've ever known, and certainly not myself, is going to have any interest in doing that story. And when I was asked to run for president by John McConnell, the founder of Earth Day, back in November of 2003, I had not yet become familiar with the 911 issue. And I was in the group that I firmly believe is the majority of the American people, which is the group that is so terrified on some subconscious level that the Bush administration could have had any complicity in the attacks of 911, that I was essentially closed-minded to the issue and not open to even considering it. And I basically bought the government's story of what happened on 911 100%, I'm embarrassed to say in retrospect. And then a gentleman in Maine named David Kubiak, who's the executive director of 911truth.org, who ultimately became my campaign manager in New Hampshire, only agreed to be my campaign manager if I would run as the so-called 911 truth candidate, which I did. And the reason I bring that up is that when I went to New Hampshire on January the 3rd of 2004, Kubiak gave me the book, The War on Freedom. And I read that book, and I had such respect for his research and the way that the book was footnoted and so on, that when I finished the book, I sat in the Econo Lodge in Manchester, New Hampshire, and realized that there were only two possibilities. Either that book was a total fraud, and he had very cleverly perpetrated that fraud by making up so on, or much to my horror, the Bush administration was in fact complicit in the attacks. And so I struggled with that through the New Hampshire primary and afterward, and I have been working on and researching that issue ever since. And so for those of you who are new to the issue, all I ask you to do tonight is to have a bit of an open mind and to ask whatever questions or make whatever comments you have to make at the end of the evening, and we'll have a very interesting interchange, I am confident. But the truth of the matter is that I think the 911 Truth movement on a nationwide basis is really at a critical juncture. And there is bad news and good news, I think, with regard to what's going on with the 911 Truth movement. The bad news, unfortunately, which I'll cover first, and again, I'll be very curious to get feedback and thoughts from those of you that have put your blood, sweat, and tears into this movement for, in many cases of those of you who I know for longer than I have. But there are some realities that I think we have to face up to. And one of them is that the movement has become one that on a national basis, in any sense that can really depose this administration, has unfortunately become one that lacks any kind of a unified vision or a course of action on a national basis. And what I mean by that is that in my observation and traveling around the country and talking to 911 groups and stuff and knowing a lot of the people involved around the country now, it has kind of devolved into what I would call a decentralized free-for-all. There's tremendous infighting now within the 911 Truth Movement, and I'm sure to some extent it's even been true here in Seattle, where the movement has basically broken into two distinct groups. One group calls themselves the evidentiary group, and David Kubiak of 911 Truth is one of those people. He's a very well-educated and very smart man and has worked very hard on this issue for 3 years. And the evidentiary group believes that the 911 movement and people in the 911 movement should not talk about anything that can't be documented, can't be proven, can't be shown to a skeptic to be true. The other group, which appears to be the dominant group to me, is what we call the pod people, the people that saw Dave Von Kleist film In Plain Sight and believe that there were missiles fired into the Twin Towers, that the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, blew up the Twin Towers, that it was not a plane that hit the Pentagon, and so on and so forth. And I'll be very curious to see what your comments are on that particular point when we get to the conversational part. But I think, sadly, that the people that have put out allegations like that on any kind of a large public scale, to the extent that they were given a voice in some way, have done a tremendous amount of damage to the 911 Truth Movement. And the reason I say that is that if I were a journalist now at the New York Times or the Washington Post, and some of the very well-intentioned and hard-working people that I know in the 911 Truth Movement came to me as a reporter at the New York Times or Washington Post and made the case in the same way that they make it to me as a 911 activist, I have to be very honest and say that I would not probably take those people very seriously, and I would be inclined to label them with the label that I hate so much, which is conspiracy theorist or kook or whatever. And but let me see a show of hands, actually. But how many of you that are knowledgeable about the 911 movement do feel that films like In Plain Sight have done damage to the movement by harming its credibility rather than increasing its credibility? How many people feel that way? And how many people, if anyone, feel that In Plain Sight has enhanced the 911 Truth Movement and helped the movement? Very, very interesting. So it's a unanimous judgment. The other thing that's been going on a lot that I'm sure a number of you are familiar with is all of the infighting and character assassination that has gone on within the movement, where people attack each other. They spam out emails and they give lists of names of who the government infiltrators are, or the CIA agents are, or the troublemakers are, or the idiots are, that are, in their estimation, harming the 911 Truth Movement. And Michael Rupert, who I know some of you have seen speak, has been embroiled in that kind of debate now, and he has a person named Mark Rabinowitz, who lives down in Eugene, Oregon, who routinely now just viciously attacks people and makes, you know, absolute statements about what happened or didn't happen and who you can believe and who you can't believe. And because that's the dynamic that's out there on the internet and at a lot of public events, I think, again, that's an issue that has done harm to the hard-working, honest, and honorable people, a number of whom are sitting here tonight, that have really worked hard against all odds to make this a national issue in a way that would end the presidency of George Bush and hopefully send him and Dick Cheney to prison for a very, very long time. And I cling to that dream. After everything that I have been through personally, The only thing that sustains me day in and day out is the sincere belief that George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and a few others will, in my lifetime, be tried for treason and sent to prison. And I dream of that more than I dream of anything. Thank you very much. How many of you were aware of the article in Popular Mechanics when it came out a couple of months ago? The Popular Mechanics article, I think, is a double-edged sword, actually. What I think is so interesting about the Popular Mechanics article is that Popular Mechanics would feel the need to do the article in the first place, especially, as most of you know, since the author of the article, it turns out, is a relative of Michael Chertoff, the new head of the Department of Homeland Security. That's another nice little coincidence in the way that the 9/11 story has played out, that yet again there's something that makes you very, very suspicious about how that could be possible. But I happened to be in Georgia about 6 or 7 weeks ago when the editor-in-chief of Popular Mechanics was on with Anderson Cooper on CNN, and although a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen it since on tape or on the internet or whatever, I actually saw it live, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. My favorite, and Anderson Cooper just threw him softball questions, absurdly, easy questions that he could then just hit out of the park and attempt very seriously to discredit the whole 9/11 truth movement in about a 7 or 8 minute segment. But to my mind, if I were given a chance tomorrow to go to Washington and address the U.S. Congress, and I had 5 minutes to give my best piece of evidence for why a proper investigation of 9/11 is warranted, I would probably go with the collapse of Building 7. If to anyone new to this issue, if you spend 15 minutes looking into the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, you must immediately come to the conclusion that we are not being told the truth. The reason for that is that the video exists, as many of you know, that shows beyond a doubt that the building collapsed from the penthouse down, and that it went straight down in free fall, exactly like a building does that has been demolished by professionals. Some of you may not know that on the night of September 11th on the CBS Evening News, about an hour after the building had collapsed, Dan Rather said just that. He said it looks amazingly like a controlled demolition of a building. Well, some of you, especially those of you who are new here tonight, probably don't know that in a PBS series in a PBS special, that was put on by WNET in New York, Larry Silverstein, the brand new landlord, leaseholder of the World Trade Center, incredibly said that the building had been pulled. I don't remember the exact words, but he basically said the fire department called him and they discussed the fact that there had been such a terrible loss of life and that the fire department was afraid they would be unable to control the fire, so they suggested that Silverstein suggested we pull it. Then they pulled it and we watched the building fall together. Well, to anyone who works in the controlled demolition trade, and now to probably millions of Americans who are aware of what's happening, pull it means controlled demolition of the building. The 911 Commission doesn't mention one word about Larry Silverstein's comment that they chose to destroy the building, number one. Number two, another fact that I'm sure many of you that are in the movement know very well, and probably the other oddest fact about 911, is that prior to 911, never had a steel reinforced building collapsed from fire. Never. And there are now documented more than a dozen cases around the world, including in the US, of high-rise steel reinforced buildings that burned throughout the building, flames coming out of the windows for hours, in some cases 30, 40 hours, where the fire department could not put the fire out, and the building was essentially destroyed, but it did not collapse. Well, On September 11th, we had 3 buildings collapse. The 2 towers of the World Trade Center collapsed within an hour or so of catching fire, and World Trade Center 7 collapsed when the fires were tiny and nothing struck the building. No airplane, no other building fell on it. Absolutely nothing happened to World Trade Center Building 7 that would account for the collapse, and yet it collapsed. The 911 Commission completely ignored that issue. There is not a single word in the 911 Commission report about Building 7. The next thing I want to point out, to go back to 1 second about the present state that the 911 movement is in, was what happened with New York State Attorney General Eliot Spitzer. The people at 911truth.org put a lot of work into literally cornering Eliot Spitzer physically at a luncheon and in a phone call back at the time of right after the Republican convention. And Spitzer agreed to look into the matter of what happened on 911. He said, this was in early December actually, and Spitzer told 2 different people that I know personally from 911truth.org that they should call his office in early January after the new year, and that he would look at what they had, and that because of the Zogby poll that came out on the opening day of the Republican convention, that 49% of New Yorkers, meaning people that live in the 5 boroughs of New York City, 49% felt that the Bush administration had advanced knowledge of the attacks and allowed them to happen, and 66% felt that the 911 Commission failed to get at the truth and there should be a proper investigation. As most of you know, Eliot Spitzer now intends to run for governor of New York State. He probably saw, something of a political opportunity with a hot potato story, and so he agreed to take a look at 911. Unfortunately, before Christmas, a lot of pretty kooky people came out of the woodwork and got to Eliot Spitzer in various ways and sent him packages with their, wild theories and personal investigations about what happened. And understandably so, Eliot Spitzer ran for cover and now does not return anybody's phone calls. So the reason I bring that up is I think that the debacle with Eliot Spitzer was a major turning point in the battle, because after that came the Popular Mechanics article, and now we are where we are. The other major turning point, and some of you even in the 911 movement may not know what a hero he was and what courage he showed, but that was U.S. Senator Mark Dayton of Minnesota. In the climate that we're talking about, where fear and intimidation has been used by the Bush administration in Washington to silence anyone of any influence that wants to speak out about this issue, Mark Dayton spoke out very courageously about his suspicions about the NORAD stand down and the NORAD failure, and that he suspected there might have in fact been a stand down by NORAD, and that he felt that issue should be investigated. His office was then targeted with a rumor of a terrorist attack, if you remember, around the time of the election, right before the election. He closed his office down, sent his staff home, and then not long after the election, Senator Dayton announced that he will not seek re-election, which is a tragedy almost beyond my comprehension, actually, because Mark Dayton in the Senate and Cynthia McKinney, who was re-elected back to the House after being run out of the House when she said immediately after 9/11 that it was suspicious and the Bush administration may have had something to do with it, and she was treated like a kook. Cynthia McKinney's back in the House. Mark Dayton is gone from the Senate. But I was just in Washington a couple of weeks ago working on a documentary film about the religious right. And I talked to 2 members of Congress and some other sources on Capitol Hill who say that Mark Dayton, it was made clear to Mark Dayton that if he didn't stand down from the Senate and keep his mouth shut, that he would be a dead man, and that he loves his family, and that Mark Dayton has chosen to step aside and be silenced. The last point I want to make before I get to the good news is the distinction which I've talked about for a year now primarily because I am a journalist and that's the mentality that I bring to things. But that is the difference between causing an investigation to happen and conducting an investigation yourself. Unfortunately, there's no one, at least that I know of, in the 911 Truth movement who has the background and the credentials and the skills to be able to conduct an investigation of what happened into 911 and then go to Capitol Hill and have members of the Congress or the Washington Post or the White House or anybody pay much attention to them. And I think that was a critical juncture in the 911 movement, which is something that is my sense of what we need to do now, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But the fact that so many investigations were conducted by people that came up with all this, fairly crazy stuff for which there is no substantiating evidence, as opposed to all of the millions of man and woman hours that have been spent on this issue being conglomerated into one effort to get the Congress to conduct a proper investigation of what did happen on 9/11 and then have Congress do the right thing, which is to impeach Bush and or, in what I imagine will be an unprecedented thing in American history, to charge an incumbent U.S. president with treason. But we'll come back to that in terms of what I think we need to do. The good news now, which is always my favorite part, but I'm the grandson of a Methodist minister, and I've been an activist for 35 years, and I have seen in my lifetime that the good guys have usually won. We won in the Vietnam War, we won in Watergate, we won in the Pentagon Papers, we won in getting Nelson Mandela out of prison, and then along comes George W. Bush, and an awful lot of people like myself and many of you here tonight are still reeling from the shock of finding out how powerful this administration is and how difficult it is to get the truth out about many issues, not just 911. But the thing that I believe as a human being and as a journalist more than I believe anything is that the truth is a mighty sword. I believe that with every bone in my body. And because I believe that, and because I believe that the truth of what happened on 9/11 is arguably the most important truth in American history, I hope to be able to inspire you tonight to take a new view of things and to start taking some very specific actions that I believe if we can come together as a national movement and do, that we can end this administration and do something that will really turn this country around. That said, the most important person now, I think, in the 911 movement, and unfortunately he doesn't see himself as a leader at all, and he is retired and a slightly older gentleman, and he's very fearful for his life because I speak to him from time to time. He's very, very afraid for his well-being, but he's going out and doing very courageous things, is David Ray Griffin, the author of The New Pearl Harbor. And absolutely, I'd like to give Mr. Griffin a hand. For those of you who have never heard of him, he is a world-famous theologian and philosopher. He was the head of the religion department at Claremont College in Southern California for his entire career. He's written somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 books that are critically acclaimed on theology and religion and philosophy. He, like I, was very skeptical of the 911 Truth movement when it first manifested, but having an inquisitive mind and extraordinary credentials, he took a look at the issue, and he published just an amazing book. Are David Ray Griffin's books for sale, both in the back? His first book was called The New Pearl Harbor. and it was published in February of 2004. And to the extent that I have any claim to fame at all, it is the fact that the New Pearl Harbor ends with my presidency, my presidential run in New Hampshire, and God bless him, he predicted that by Election Day millions of people would know about me, and by my count, maybe 600 or 800 knew about me by Election Day, so he was off by about 2.97 million, but 600 is better than nothing. But he writes like a logician, like someone who deconstructs a story. He doesn't come off like a crazy person. He doesn't come off like a conspiracy theorist. And he writes so eloquently and so simply that a 12-year-old can understand what he's writing about, and a PhD can be stunned by how well he makes a presentation. To those of you who don't know where the title came from, there's a very sinister organization in Washington that is at the heart of the Bush administration that 3 chapters of my book are about. It's called the Project for the New American Century, known as PNAC. PNAC was founded in the late 1990s during the Clinton administration by William Crystal, who's now the editor of the Weekly Standard. And on September 1st of 2000, before George Bush was ever selected president in the 2000 election, PNAC issued a report called Rebuilding America's Defenses. You can read it online by going to Google and putting in Project for New American Century, and it'll come right up for you to read. And I would encourage those of you who are new to the topic tonight to take a very serious look at this document. Essentially what it says is that after the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has no meaningful opposition on the planet. And that since that is a fact, the U.S. must use its military might to preclude the possibility of ever having another enemy on this planet that in any way can militarily challenge the U.S. It then talks about the fact that the oil and gas resources from the Caspian Sea and from Eurasia are a very large part of the survivability of the United States in the 21st century, and that since that is the case, we need to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, topple the governments, and clear the way for the Unocal pipeline from the Caspian Sea through Afghanistan. The report states that the American people will not support simultaneous large-scale wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere unless there is, quote, a galvanizing incident on the order of a new Pearl Harbor. To those of you that are new to this issue tonight, I think that you need to read this report and ponder that and ask yourself the question whether it could possibly be a coincidence that that report was issued on September 1st, 2000. George W. Bush ascended to the presidency in November, and on September the 11th, 2001, 9 months into his presidency, they get exactly what they were asking for, and we then invade Afghanistan and Iraq. David Ray Griffin took his title from that report, as I said, and he wrote a wonderful book. The review that came out in Publishers Weekly, which you can also find online, was 1 paragraph long. It neglected to point out his amazing credentials, and it said, this is so crazy that not even a self-respecting conspiracy theorist would take it seriously. So Publishers Weekly dismissed him right off the bat. The book so far has sold about 65,000 copies, which is an amazing success story for a small publisher and an author writing on such a controversial topic. And from time to time, David Ray Griffin goes around the country and makes major speeches, one of which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But first I want to tell you about his second book. His second book came out about 2.5 months ago, and it's called 911 Commission Omissions and Errors. And it's about the same size as the first book, you know, short and sweet, and he literally destroys the 911 Commission report. He talks in great detail, well-researched, well-footnoted about the things that inexplicably the 9/11 Commission did not mention at all. Right off the bat, in the opening chapter, after the introduction, he establishes the fact, which I've known now for about 6 months myself, but I thought it was 5, that 6 of the hijackers are still alive. They live in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt. What's really amazing about the fact of the matter is that they were apparently the victims of identity theft, but 3 of the 6 were in the flight schools in Florida and Arizona at the time the government says they were. One of them is now a pilot for Saudi Airlines. He was outraged when it was said on the news that he was one of the 9/11 hijackers. He raised hell with the Saudi government, and he's now been interviewed by Al Jazeera and several Arab newspapers and one English newspaper, all of whom independently have researched and established the fact that he is the actual person that the government says was flying the plane, and his name is Al-Shayhi, the real person who supposedly was at the controls of the plane that hit the Pentagon, if it was in fact a plane. So I would point out that that's another instance of something that's absolutely factual, that if you spend 5 minutes looking at, that alone should be enormously troubling to the Congress and to the White House and to the Washington Post and to the New York Times. And not only is it not troubling, but they don't even return phone calls when we try to bring that to their attention. The other interesting fact that David Ray Griffin establishes in the second book is how NORAD's timeline of what happened that morning makes no sense whatsoever. They have repeatedly changed their story. The timelines don't match up at all, so they can't even get their story straight. And General Richard Myers, who thank God is finally no longer the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually changed his testimony 3 different times, 2 times being before the U.S. Congress, and to this day, nobody has ever subpoenaed Richard Myers to say, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'd like to put your conflicting statements up on the wall here, and let's work our way through this and figure out how it is that you don't know what happened that morning, and do you stand by any of these 3 versions of your story, and if not, why not, and what's going on here? And again, that's been absolutely ignored as well. So if you're only going to buy one book tonight, even more important than buying my book, I think, is to buy David Ray Griffin's second book, 9/11 Commission, Omissions and Errors. It's an extraordinary document that hopefully will give you a very quick education about what we're up against. The wonderful thing about David is that he's a 70-year-old, soft-spoken, white-haired gentleman who never raises his voice or gets upset, apparently, and he's just as relentless in terms of how he presents his story and presents his facts, and he's made major inroads around the country on some pretty major college campuses. Last week, he made a major appearance in Madison, Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin, and we're on the verge of a major breakthrough, which is that C-SPAN is apparently going to be the first mainstream media outlet, hopefully next weekend on the program Book Notes, to present David Ray Griffin's talk. And what's really interesting about what he's doing now is that he's addressing it as a Christian issue of faith. He has couched it as a theologian in religious terms, in the context that if you are a faithful person and you believe that there is a power higher than us, that higher power must now be invoked to help us get the truth of 9/11 out, because we have not, unfortunately, been very successful on our own. So one of the things I would encourage all of you to do is to go to C-SPAN's website, which is c-span.org, Check it every day for the schedule. When you get a confirmation of the fact that it is going to be on Book Notes next weekend, which is a program that's only broadcast on the weekends, please email out to everyone you know, no matter how skeptical they are, that they need to watch this program, and have everyone they know watch this program, because we may very well be at the turning point that we've all dreamed of in the context of an opportunity to really break the story. The other thing that I would ask you to do, that I asked in October, and I know a number of you did, is to call the executive editor of the New York Times, whose name is Bill Keller. His phone number is 212-556-1234, and his email address is executive-editor@nytimes.com, and also to call Leonard Downey, the executive editor of the Washington Post. Unfortunately, I have very short-term memory left, and I can't remember two phone numbers at once, so you'll have to go to Google and get the Washington Post phone number. But to call and or email, and get everyone you can to do the same, to alert the Washington Post to the fact that David Ray Griffin is on C-SPAN talking very credibly about what happened on 9/11, because that really, well, there's a couple of other things I want to cover first, and then I want to get into a specific. Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. It's executive-editor@nytimes.com, and his name is Bill Keller, K-E-L-L-E-R. Absolutely. Thank you, sir, and I apologize for talking too fast. The most amazing thing about David Ray Griffin is that Larry Flint, the legendary First Amendment champion, who happens to be the publisher of Hustler magazine, has actually convinced David Ray Griffin to do an interview with Hustler magazine, which is going to be out in the July issue, that'll be out on newsstands May 15th. Now, I feel very odd in a church encouraging men and women to go out and buy Hustler magazine, so since I can't do that, you'll have to find somebody who read it so they can tell you what was in it. But I understand it's going to be quite explosive, and that Larry Flint has taken this issue on very seriously and intends to really make some trouble for the Bush administration with this interview. What's that? That's a question for Reverend Lang. I can't answer that question. I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment on that. Oh, that's great. artsandletters.com. Very cool. The other thing, the two other quick points I wanted to make before I talk specifically about what I think we need to do on a larger scale, and I think can be done now, is to make two other quick points. Cynthia McKinney in the House. I had the honor of meeting her last September at a 911 event in New York, and she is an amazing woman. I mean, just incredibly courageous and joyous to be back in the House to have a chance to fight for this issue. So the other thing I would encourage you to do is to call, and to have everyone you know call Cynthia McKinney's office. The number at the U.S. Capitol is 202-224-3121. Ask for Cynthia McKinney's office. Ask for someone you can talk to thank her and encourage her in her fight to get the truth out about 9/11, because I don't know how many of you saw it, but she beat the living hell out of Donald Rumsfeld a few weeks ago in testimony about the Iraq War, and there's a transcript on various sites on the internet, and she absolutely humiliated Donald Rumsfeld to the point that he was left looking like a babbling idiot, which is a fairly rare thing for Donald Rumsfeld. The last point I'd like to make before I get into my sense of what we need to do is a point that I started with. But I have enormous respect for those of you who have worked so hard for so long on this issue to get the truth out. And I would just implore you, despite all of the things that I've touched on that are wrong with the 911 Truth Movement, in some ways to cling to the belief and to never abandon the belief that we will get the truth out and prevail on this issue. The only thing we need to talk about is how to do that in a way that will work, and how to do that in a way that will overcome the mistakes and missteps that we've made up until now. It seems to me that based on, I was a 21-year-old journalist in New York when Watergate happened, and 22 years old when the Pentagon Papers came out, and so on. But I've been around long enough as a somewhat cynical journalist to understand that no matter what the issue is, if there is wrongdoing in Washington or in the White House, there's basically only three ways that it can be dealt with in a way that will bring down a sitting president of the United States. The first way is a joint investigation of the Congress, as was the case in Watergate. The second is major media coverage by either the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, or one of the three major television networks. And the third is for 30 or 40 million people to riot in the streets and demand the truth. And I can tell you that's not going to happen, as you all know, which leaves us with the first two. I have had enough conversations in the last year with the New York Times and the Washington Post to know from direct personal experience that they're not going to touch this story until they have a very powerful reason to do so, which brings me back to the congressional investigation. I firmly believe that what we need to focus on now, and what we need to work on now, and what we need to demand now is a congressional investigation based on the work of David Ray Griffin and his exposure of the fraud of the 911 Commission. So what I'm going to ask you all to do is to think about that and to personally get involved in a way that will either allow you to travel to Washington to lobby members of Congress, or to help send someone to Washington to lobby members of Congress, or to call someone you know in Washington and have them lobby members of the U.S. Congress. But I believe that enough factual evidence has been established that if we take this battle to Capitol Hill, we can win this fight, and we can shame the Republican Party into being forced to look at this issue. And if we can get the Republican Congress to look at this issue, George W. Bush will pay the price, I can guarantee you. But I think we need to change our strategy away from conducting all these amateur investigations that we don't have the capability or the credibility to do, and demand that our congressional representatives conduct a full and proper investigation. And I believe that if that happens, the New York Times and Washington Post and the networks will have no choice but to deal with it, and that the game will be up, and we will face a horrible constitutional crisis, much like Watergate, but that just as the Constitution held up during Watergate and during the Pentagon Papers, the Constitution will hold up again, and George W. Bush will be gone and banished and left for history and criminal courts to deal with. That said, before I open it up to questions, I wanted to just touch real quickly on what Rich mentioned about the agenda of the religious right, and the stuff from my book that, much to my horror, has come true. But when I was here in October, I talked about the so-called Dominionist Movement, and particularly this very draconian piece of legislation known as the Constitution Restoration Act, which was introduced in March of last year, and it was co-written by Judge Roy Moore, the Ten Commandments judge from Alabama, and a constitutional lawyer named Herb Titus, who used to be Pat Robertson's henchman. And it was introduced in the House by Representative Robert Adderholt of Alabama, and in the Senate by Richard Shelby of Alabama. When I was here in October, a gentleman in the back there at the end stood up and said that he had respected, my remarks and some of the things that I had to say, but that if I thought the Constitution Restoration Act would ever see the light of day, that I was an idiot and very naive. I was just in Washington 2 weeks ago with a 60 Minutes film crew for this documentary film that I'm writing and directing now about the agenda of the religious right. We got an interview with Congressman Christopher Shays, the very well-known moderate from Connecticut, and much to my surprise, he said in the interview on camera that not only does he expect the Constitution Restoration Act to pass now, but that he, quote, believes it will be the destruction of the Constitution, the destruction of the Republican Party, and the destruction of this country. I spoke yesterday for an hour with Reverend Joseph Huff, who's the president of Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University, and Bill Moyers is his best friend. Even more to my shock, yesterday, Reverend Huff, who's considered the preeminent theologian in the United States of America, told me that he expects that the genie is out of the bottle and that he is very pessimistic. He believes the extreme religious right will win the war and that, quote, America as we have known it will be destroyed. I just want to tell you real quick what it was I talked about in my book and in October that I confirmed 2 weeks ago, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments. The Dominionist Movement was founded by a gentleman who's dead now named R.J. Rushdoony. R.J. Rushdoony wrote a very famous book in 1973 called The Institutes of Biblical Law that you can still buy at Amazon.com. His son-in-law, whose name is Gary North, is now the godfather of the Dominionist Movement. The Dominionists number around 35 million people, mostly evangelical and Pentecostal Christians in rural areas. Their agenda is to abolish the Constitution and to replace civil law with Old Testament biblical law. There is a vast public record established in the Dominionist movement, including an article that came out 2 days ago in Harper's Magazine on the front cover saying the Christian rights war in America. They publicly talked about, in my film, proudly 2 weeks ago, they will execute homosexuals, they will execute abortion doctors, they will execute women who get abortions, they will execute adulterers, and they will execute juvenile delinquents. We need a little bit of levity there, so I wonder who's going to be left if they execute all of those people. It'll be a population reduction move, but there's not going to be much of a population left in my estimation. They are very, very serious. 3 of the people that I interviewed, including former Ambassador Alan Keyes, who has run for president twice and just ran for the Senate in Illinois, said into a 60 Minutes camera that this is going to be a Christian nation, and if you don't want a Christian nation, get the hell out now before it's too late, because there's going to be a civil war. I asked Ambassador Keyes, do you expect that there will be bloodshed and there will be another U.S. civil war where the Christian right wants to kill everyone but the Christian right? And he said, I fear that that's what it will come to, and we on the Christian right are going to win. I had a long conversation with Rich last night, and I am much more terrified by what is happening with the religious right now than I am the 911 Truth Movement. For those of you who don't know, Senator Bill Frist, the Senate Majority Leader, is going to appear Sunday night in Louisville, Kentucky, with Reverend James C. Dobson, who reaches an audience of 200 million people every week around the world in 80 countries with his television and radio broadcasts. James Dobson has publicly proclaimed that women who get abortions and homosexuals should be executed and will be executed in his lifetime, that Roe v. Wade will be overturned, and he has backed for public office, including for the U.S. Congress, people who profess to believe that abortion doctors and women who get abortions should be executed. One of them is now a first-term Republican from Texas in the House, and I saw him on CNN after the election, and he says that he hopes by the end of his first term, Roe versus Wade will have been overturned and abortion doctors and women who get abortions will be publicly executed. Believe it or not, the method of execution that they say they will use because they want to literally impose Old Testament law is public stoning. Public stoning of homosexuals and women who get abortions. So I would also encourage you to go to Google or Yahoo and put in Dominionism or R.J. Rushdoony, which is R-U-S-H-D-O-O-N-Y, and learn for yourselves what we are up against, because Bill Frist is going to appear with James Dobson in a church in Louisville, Kentucky, Sunday night, and say that filibuster attempts by Democrats to block Bush's judicial nominees are an attack on Christian faith. It was reported this morning that a group of progressive churches has gotten together a counter protest at another church in Louisville several blocks away, and a reporter for the LA Times, the White House reporter for the LA Times, told me at 1 o'clock this afternoon that he has a source that says that the Louisville Courier-Journal is going to report tomorrow morning that there could be bloodshed Sunday night in Louisville, Kentucky when Christians attack other Christians in the streets. And I pray and hope that does not happen, but that's what we're up against. The Constitution Restoration Act is a piece of legislation you need to know about, familiarize yourself with, call your congressional representatives about, and raise hell about, because if this thing comes to a vote, 911 will look like a Boy Scout meeting, I promise you. That said, I very much look forward to taking all of your questions and comments on anything relating to the religious right. Rich is going to speak as the minister, and I'll speak as the journalist, and we'll come down in the middle somewhere. But I hope that you have lots of good questions and comments for us, and that we can have a bit of a dialogue.